1956. Small-town America. The hum of clippers fills a barber shop as a crackling radio interrupts. Congressman Emanuel Seller and Senator Estes Kefauver warn that Elvis Presley is a danger to America's youth. His movements and songs, they say, are corrupting the nation. The men in the chairs laugh, shaking their heads. One of them mutters, "He's just a kid from Memphis with a guitar." The barber leans closer, voice low. "If Washington is talking about him, then it's bigger than we think." Beyond the chatter and laughter, a picture comes into focus. On one side, a shy young man who once drove trucks, now singing with unfiltered passion. On the other, seasoned politicians stoking fear, using parents' anxieties as a weapon. This is mid-1950s America. Tight collars, Sunday sermons, and the quiet dread of change. Every note Presley sings collides with a generation terrified of losing control. And in that collision, a battle begins. The state against the boy who dared to move when the music told him to. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The summer air in Memphis was thick with heat, and the sound of jukeboxes spilling rhythm and blues into every corner cafe. On Union Avenue, inside a modest studio with peeling paint and the faint smell of cigarettes clinging to the walls, a nervous 19-year-old stepped up to the microphone. His hair was slicked back, his shirt collar open, his guitar trembling slightly in his hands. Sam Phillips, the owner of Sun Records, leaned back in his chair, watching. There was nothing extraordinary at first glance about the boy, until he began to sing. What poured out was a voice that seemed older than his years, yet bursting with restless energy, a mix of gospel fervor and the raw pulse of rhythm and blues. The session men barely kept up, their eyes darting to each other as if to say, "What is happening here?" When the song ended, there was silence in the room, the kind that comes only after something has shifted forever. Phillips finally muttered, almost to himself, "That's the sound I've been looking for." Within months, the name Elvis Presley began to ripple through the South. Radio DJs put his first single on the air, and teenagers pressed their ears to speakers as though catching a secret not meant for their parents. His first live appearances drew crowds who were unprepared for what they saw. A young man who didn't just sing but moved, hips snapping, legs shaking, body alive with rhythm. Girls screamed so loudly the band sometimes lost the beat. Boys, even those who mocked him, found themselves mimicking his stance in front of mirrors. But admiration among the young came with fury from the old. Pastors filled their Sunday sermons with warnings. "This is not music," thundered one preacher in Mississippi. "This is the devil's trick to steal our children." Newspapers carried letters from mothers who claimed their daughters fainted in sinful hysteria after his shows. "He should be banned from television," one letter to the New York Daily News read, "before he ruins an entire generation." By 1956, the noise had grown louder. National papers like the New York Times ran pieces describing his movements on stage as vulgar gyrations. Editorials suggested his pelvic contortions were nothing more than pornography disguised as music. What astonished the boy from Memphis was how quickly the debate leapt from music to morality, as though strumming a guitar and swinging his hips could topple the pillars of American society. In small towns, local officials debated banning his concerts. A Texas city councilman declared, "We don't need this kind of filth corrupting our youth." At rallies, community leaders warned parents to keep their children home on nights when Presley came to town. Yet the more the adults panicked, the more the young showed up, lining sidewalks, breaking through police barriers, clutching ticket stubs like treasure. The most striking condemnation came from Senator Estes Kefauver, a figure already known for leading hearings on organized crime and obscenity in entertainment. In a televised interview, he declared, "This young man represents a threat to the moral fabric of our youth. He teaches rebellion, promiscuity, and disrespect for authority. America must be vigilant." His words carried weight. Families sat in living rooms, staring at black and white screens, and many nodded along, convinced they were witnessing the beginning of cultural collapse. Elvis, meanwhile, was barely out of his teens. He had grown up in poverty, raised by a mother who clung fiercely to her faith, and a father who drifted in and out of steady work. Now he was being called a national danger. After a night of headlines branding him the hillbilly cat who seduced youth with his hips, he sat alone in his small Memphis home. The echoes of screaming fans still rang in his ears, but here there was only quiet. He stood in front of the mirror, his hair mussed, sweat drying on his shirt. His reflection stared back, no longer the shy boy who once carried a guitar to Hume's high school, but not yet the icon people painted him to be. He touched the edge of the mirror as if to steady himself. "Why are they so angry?" he thought. "All I did was move, the way the music made me move." His hand trembled. The boy who had once sung hymns with his mother at church was now the nation's menace. Across town, churches organized prayer circles to protect the children. Clergymen wrote letters urging television networks to cancel his appearances. Some compared his influence to narcotics, an intoxicant that spread invisibly. The fear seemed almost theatrical, but for Elvis, it was personal. He could feel the walls closing in with every headline. And yet, the contradictions piled up. The more they denounced him, the more records sold. In Memphis drugstores, teenagers slipped coins into jukeboxes to play "That's All Right" again and again, until shop owners pulled the plug. At night, car radios blared his songs across empty highways, the sound bouncing off the fields where cotton once grew. The country was divided, but the divide was not neat. Some parents secretly tapped their feet while condemning him aloud. And some pastors admitted privately that their children had already memorized his lyrics. The pressure reached into his most private moments. One evening, after a particularly harsh sermon aired on the radio calling him an agent of sin, Elvis found himself pacing the floor, unable to sleep. His mother, Gladys, tried to soothe him, saying softly, "Baby, you just sing what's in your heart. Don't let them scare you." But when she left the room, he sank into a chair, staring at the floorboards, feeling the weight of being both adored and despised, before he even understood why. The paradox was clear. The more society branded him as dangerous, the more magnetic he became to the generation coming of age in the mid-50s. In the spaces between fear and fascination, Elvis Presley was no longer just a boy from Memphis. He had become a symbol of rebellion, of freedom, of everything that frightened the gatekeepers of American morality. And though he was still learning to stand tall in the storm itself was only beginning. By 1956, the controversy had swollen into something larger than any song, any performance. It was no longer about whether Elvis Presley could sing. It was about what America feared it was becoming. Parents complained that discipline was eroding. Pastors warned of a moral collapse, and senators smelled an opportunity to turn one boy's hips into a national crisis. Television networks moved first. When Elvis appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in September, the orders came down from executives: keep the cameras above his waist. Millions tuned in expecting to see the notorious gyrations that had been denounced from pulpits and political stages. Instead, The audience at home saw a neatly framed young man from the chest up, grinning shyly between verses. In living rooms across the country, mothers sighed with relief, while teenagers groaned that the censors had stolen the very thing that made the music feel alive. Behind the scenes, a genuine panic was brewing. Radio stations received phone calls from angry parents demanding they stop playing his records. One school superintendent in Ohio wrote to local officials, "If we do not control the spread of this music, we will lose an entire generation to delinquency." Committees were formed, meetings held, and across small towns, signs appeared outside high schools. No rock and roll on school grounds. The issue quickly reached the national stage. The Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency, which had once focused on comic books and crime dramas, now turned its eye toward rock and roll. In hearings that stretched into the evening, congressmen debated whether Presley's music could, in fact, undermine the moral fabric of the country. Photographers captured the solemn faces of senators as they read aloud quotes from pastors describing his performances as sex in motion. Newspapers splashed the images across front pages with headlines like "Rock and Roll on Trial." Outside the hearing rooms, journalists circled like hawks. They chased Presley down alleyways, shouted questions at him as he left recording studios, thrust microphones in his face before concerts. "Do you realize," one reporter demanded in Dallas, "that mothers say you are destroying their daughter's innocence?" Another asked bluntly, "Are you proud to be called the most dangerous entertainer in America?" Each question was designed to catch him off guard, to provoke a stumble that could be replayed on the evening news. The scrutiny was relentless. In Texas, a city council proposed an ordinance banning his concerts outright. "If we allow this behavior in our halls," one councilman declared, "we may as well hand whiskey to every child in town." Local newspapers praised the proposal, while teenagers spray-painted Elvis's name on school walls in defiance. The divide between generations had never felt sharper, but the harshest words came from the mouths of politicians who sensed moral outrage could be weaponized. On a popular television panel, a conservative senator leaned toward the camera and said with a grim expression, "Presley is more dangerous to our youth than alcohol or gambling. He is a disease, and we must contain him." The line was repeated in papers across the country, igniting new waves of debate at dinner tables and church socials. For Elvis himself, the attacks carried a sting he could not shake. At 21, he was still more boy than man, still trying to understand the machinery of fame that had swallowed him. After one particularly brutal article, he received a letter from his mother, written in her careful hand. She reminded him of nights they had spent singing gospel hymns together, of the faith that had carried their family through poverty. "Don't let them break you, son," she wrote. "Sing from your heart, because that's the only truth you owe anybody." The letter became his talisman. He folded it and slipped it into his jacket pocket before concerts, fingers brushing against the paper, as though it could shield him from the cameras and the jeers. When he walked onto a stage in Florida, facing a wall of flashbulbs and questions about morality, he felt the crinkle of the paper against his chest. He didn't quote it aloud, but the words steadied his voice as he sang. Still, the storm did not quiet. Schools sent home circulars warning parents about the dangers of Presley music. Radio preachers thundered that America's daughters were grinding their hips like harlots because of him. The sheer absurdity might have been laughable had it not weighed so heavily on his shoulders. Yet in the shadows of the moral panic, the crowds only grew. In city after city, police struggled to contain fans who climbed fences, broke down doors, and flooded the aisles of concert halls. What senators declared as poison felt to the young like liberation. They saw in Elvis not corruption, but honesty, a refusal to sit still when the music demanded movement. The Senate hearings continued to grind on, with officials arguing whether to impose stricter controls on television broadcasts and concert venues. In smoky committee rooms, Presley's name was spoken with the gravity of a foreign threat. But outside those rooms, a different story was unfolding. One of a generation discovering its own voice, and one boy discovering that the storm around him could not silence the music inside. For Elvis, the war over his image was both bewildering and exhausting. He was a son, a performer, a dreamer who had once worked as a truck driver, and now the full weight of America's moral anxieties was pressing against his chest. On some nights, lying awake in hotel rooms filled with telegrams and half-eaten meals, he wondered if perhaps they would succeed in breaking him. Then he would reach for the folded letter in his jacket, read his mother's words again, and remind himself that the only truth worth carrying forward was the one that came from his own heart. The trial of music had begun, and whether he liked it or not, Elvis Presley stood at its center. The senators could scowl, the pastors could thunder, the papers could sneer, but the songs kept finding their way into jukeboxes, car radios, and the restless dreams of teenagers who had never seen themselves reflected so vividly before. And each night, when he stepped into the glare of the stage lights with the letter pressed close against his chest, he made the same choice: to sing as if no one could take it away. The ballroom of the Hotel Warwick in New York was bursting at the seams. It was the spring of 1957, and the press conference had been announced just days earlier. By the time Elvis arrived, the lobby was already choked with reporters, photographers, and a handful of curious onlookers craning their necks to catch a glimpse. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks against the cream-colored walls. A line of microphones bristled from the table at the front, waiting for the boy from Memphis who had somehow become the lightning rod of an entire generation's anxieties. The press corps smelled blood. For months they had been fanning the flames, preachers denouncing him, senators calling for bans, school boards voting to keep his music off campuses. The expectation was clear. This 22-year-old would be cornered. He would have to apologize, or at least squirm. The air buzzed with a cruel anticipation. Elvis stepped into the room, not in rhinestones or sequins, but in a modest dark suit. No stage lights, no screaming fans, just rows of skeptical eyes and the metallic whine of camera shutters. He adjusted his tie nervously, the gesture almost boyish. He looked younger than the monster they had described in headlines, and that dissonance unsettled the crowd for a moment. Questions flew immediately. "Mr. Presley, how do you respond to charges that your performances are obscene? Do you accept responsibility for the hysteria among teenage girls? Are you proud of the title Menace to Morality?" He smiled faintly, buying himself time, his hand brushing the edge of the microphone. Inside, his stomach twisted. He could feel the folded paper in his pocket, his mother's letter, like a secret shield. Stay calm. Don't let them rattle you. Then came the sharpest question, delivered by a journalist from a national network. His voice carried through the room. "What do you say to the politicians who insist you're a danger to America's youth?" The room froze. Pens hovered above notebooks. Photographers leaned forward, ready to capture the instant that might define or destroy him. Elvis swallowed, then leaned into the microphone. His voice was steady, not loud, but clear enough to cut through the static. "If the way I move is dangerous," he said slowly, "then what do you call the violence we see on our streets every day? I don't hand kids a knife or a bottle. I give them music. I give them a reason to smile for a few minutes. If that's a crime, then I don't understand what country we're living in." A pause followed, deep and uncomfortable. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the ballroom seemed to stop breathing. Reporters glanced at one another, unsure how to react. Then, unexpectedly, applause broke out. Not from the young fans, none were in the room, but from several journalists themselves. The sound started small, hesitant, then grew until it filled the hall. The photographers, recovering their instincts, fired off flash after flash. Elvis blinked against the light, his expression calm but inwardly astonished. He had not delivered a rehearsed speech, nor a carefully crafted defense. It had come from the gut, raw and unvarnished, and it landed. Afterward, as he left the stage, he felt the adrenaline crash against him like a wave. His knees were weak, but he walked slowly, deliberately, refusing to let them see the tremor in his body. Backstage, he leaned against the wall, exhaling hard. His manager, Colonel Parker, muttered something about good press, but Elvis barely heard. He was thinking of the silence before the applause, the way the room had hung on his words. For once, he hadn't been just a spectacle, he had been heard. The next morning, newspapers carried the exchange on their front pages. Presley fires back at critics. Some praised his composure, calling him surprisingly articulate. Others dismissed it as youthful arrogance. But the tone had shifted. He was no longer only the boy who scandalized America with a swivel of the hips. He was now the young man who dared to confront senators and preachers with plain words that resonated. Among teenagers, the effect was electric. They clipped the articles, read the quotes aloud at lunch tables, whispered them in classrooms. Elvis had not only sung for them, he had spoken for them. And for the first time, the establishment seemed rattled. The establishment, of course, did not retreat quietly. Preachers doubled down, insisting that the devil could sound clever too. Politicians warned parents not to be fooled by the sweet talk of a rebel. But beneath the fury lay something else. Fear. Because the moment Elvis spoke, the narrative slipped from their control. He had exposed the absurdity of treating joy as a greater danger than violence, of treating music as a greater threat than crime. That night, alone in his hotel room, Elvis sat at the window looking down at the city. Neon signs glowed through the glass, taxis honked, and somewhere far below, a group of girls screamed his name into the darkness. He touched the folded letter in his pocket, still there, still creased from being held so often. His hands were steady now. He knew the storm was not over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, he understood that his voice carried beyond the stage. He whispered softly to himself, almost like a prayer. If they want a fight, I'll give them truth. And if truth makes me dangerous, then I'll wear it proud. The boy who once stared nervously into a mirror in Memphis had stood his ground before the nation's fiercest critics. And though he was still learning the cost of defiance, he had found the courage to answer in his own words. That answer would echo far beyond the ballroom walls, reshaping how America saw not just him, but the music and the youth who refused to be silent. The letter arrived on a gray morning in Memphis, its envelope stamped with the authority of the United States government. Elvis tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was the official draft notice. He was to report for duty in the U.S. Army. The words seemed almost unreal. For years, his critics had called him dangerous, immoral, corrupting. Now, many of those same voices were cheering. At last, one senator declared on the radio, the Army will teach Presley discipline and make a man out of him. The news spread like wildfire. Newspapers splashed photos of him holding the notice, his expression unreadable. Editorials praised the decision as if the draft board had handed down a moral verdict, not just a legal duty. Pastors congratulated the government for bringing the boy back under control. Parents who had once demanded his music be banned now nodded in satisfaction. The army will end this nonsense. But outside recruiting stations and bus terminals, a very different picture unfolded. Girls clung to fences and wept openly. Some carried handmade signs, "Don't take our Elvis." Others simply sobbed into handkerchiefs as if watching a funeral procession. Police struggled to keep order as crowds surged around him wherever he went. The contrast could not have been sharper. Politicians smiling grimly at his departure, fans crying as though the heart of their generation was being ripped away. When the day came for him to leave, Memphis Union Station was overflowing. Elvis, dressed simply, stood among the recruits, trying to look like one of them. Cameras clicked relentlessly. He leaned down to hug his mother, who clutched him fiercely, tears streaming down her face. His father stood beside her, stiff with pride and grief. Elvis whispered, "Mama, I'll be all right. I'll do what I have to." On the train ride to Fort Hood, he sat quietly, watching the fields slide by. Reporters followed even there, pressing questions through the train windows. "Will this end your career? Do you fear being forgotten?" Elvis offered polite answers, but privately he was thinking, "If I get treated like a star, the men will hate me. If I act like one of them, maybe they'll respect me." At Fort Hood, the press descended again. Photographers snapped pictures of him in fatigues, hair cropped short. Headlines proclaimed, "Presley the Private." Politicians gloated that his reign was finished. "Let's see if the screaming girls are still waiting after 2 years," one senator sneered. But Elvis kept his head down. He marched, drilled, and learned to fold his uniforms with the same precision as every other soldier. The cameras lingered for a while, then drifted away, convinced that his career was already slipping into memory. Then came the crushing blow. Just months into his service, word arrived from Memphis. His mother, Gladys, had fallen gravely ill. Permission was granted for him to return home. He rushed back, but the reunion was brief. Within days, she was gone. The woman who had been his anchor, his protector, the one who wrote him letters to keep him strong, was suddenly no more. At the funeral, Elvis collapsed against her coffin, sobbing uncontrollably. Reporters were there too, their flashes exploding as he wept. In the days that followed, some commentators whispered that it was poetic justice, that the so-called idol of youth had been humbled by tragedy. Those words cut deeper than any headline before. When he returned to service, the change in him was visible. He was thinner, quieter, his eyes carrying a permanent shadow. Yet among the soldiers, something unexpected began to happen. In barracks and rec rooms, they played his records on portable turntables. Young officers tapped their feet, grinning sheepishly when caught. Even in Germany, where Elvis was stationed later, fellow servicemen confessed that they had hidden his singles in their duffel bags. The very institution that was supposed to tame him was humming along to his songs. At night, in his bunk, Elvis often lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The barracks smelled of boots and cigarettes, the laughter of young men drifting through the air. He missed the stage, the electricity of the crowd, but more than that, he missed his mother. In the quiet, he sometimes whispered prayers, asking if she could still hear him. And yet, despite the grief, he began to feel something stir inside, a sense of resilience, a determination not to let the world see him broken. The politicians, meanwhile, crowed that his career was dead. Entertainment magazines speculated that by the time he returned, a new crop of singers would have replaced him. But fans never forgot. They sent him letters by the thousands, filling military mailrooms with envelopes covered in lipstick marks and glitter. Girls wrote promises to wait for him. Boys wrote that they hoped to shake his hand when he came back. By the time his 2 years of service were ending, a curious thing had happened. Instead of being erased, his image had deepened. He was no longer just the wild boy on stage. He was a soldier, someone who had carried the same rifle, worn the same uniform, endured the same loneliness as countless other young men. Critics had tried to frame the draft as punishment, but for Elvis, it became something else, a crucible that transformed him from a scandalous performer into a man the nation could no longer dismiss. Standing on the tarmac as he prepared to fly back to the United States in 1960, Elvis looked out over the crowd of reporters once again waiting for him. He adjusted his cap, his expression calm. Inside, he thought of his mother, of the boys he had drilled beside, of the nights in Germany when his music had spilled from hidden record players. They had tried to silence him, but the silence had only made his voice stronger. The army was supposed to end him. Instead, it gave him something he had not expected: a second beginning. March 1960. The plane touched down at Fort Dix, New Jersey, carrying a different man than the one who had boarded for Germany 2 years earlier. Elvis Presley stepped onto American soil in uniform, his hair cropped, his frame leaner, his demeanor steady. The airfield was a circus, photographers scrambling for position, reporters shouting questions, fans pressing against the fences, their screams piercing the cold morning. Television cameras rolled live, broadcasting the moment across the country. For the first time in 2 years, America saw him not as a performer, but as a soldier coming home. Within weeks, NBC aired a special broadcast. Welcome home, Elvis. The program was drenched in ceremony. A studio set gleamed with patriotic decor. The host recited his service record with reverence. Families across America tuned in, expecting perhaps to see a humbled figure, a former idol turned into a quiet veteran. Instead, they found someone both familiar and transformed. His smile the same, but his voice richer, his posture carrying a new weight. The reaction was explosive. Girls screamed at the television as if he were in their living rooms. Record stores, which had been selling steady but modest numbers of Presley reissues during his service, suddenly saw crowds storming the counters. His first post-Army single shot to the top of the charts. Critics who had written him off as finished now scrambled to explain the resurgence. Yet as the applause roared, the backlash began anew. In the Senate, one politician muttered to the press, "We thought the army had calmed him." But no, here he is again, ready to poison the airwaves with his so-called love songs. Editorials framed his return not as a patriotic success story, but as the re-emergence of a cultural problem. The rhetoric had shifted. He was no longer accused of wild gyrations alone, but of corrupting through commerce. "This isn't art," one columnist wrote. "It's a machine designed to sell records and tickets, and it exploits our children's emotions." In schools, teachers complained that students were once again distracted by Presley's music, humming his new songs in hallways, scrawling his name across notebooks. Pastors adjusted their sermons, warning parents that discipline gained in the army is being squandered in the theater of entertainment. The attempt to reduce him to a cautionary tale had failed, so they painted him as a cynical profiteer. Amid the noise, Elvis kept working. He returned to the recording studio, laying down tracks with a new seriousness. Gone was some of the frantic edge of his earliest sessions. In its place was a deeper, more resonant tone, as if the weight of service and loss had grounded him. His handlers booked film roles, eager to capitalize on his popularity. While the movies varied in quality, they were box office successes, drawing millions. Crowds lined up not just for the music, but for the image. The soldier turned star, the man who had worn the uniform and returned to the stage. But the attacks did not relent. At a televised panel in Washington, a senator launched into a tirade. "We face a cultural epidemic. Rock and roll, spearheaded again by Presley, is eroding the values we must preserve. This is a campaign we must fight as if it were a war." The phrase, "campaign against cultural decay," was reprinted in papers nationwide. Parents who had once breathed a sigh of relief when he donned fatigues now found themselves torn once again between pride and suspicion. The press seized the controversy. Interviewers asked him pointedly, "Do you understand that many Americans still view you as a symbol of immorality?" Cameras zoomed in on his face, waiting for a stumble, a crack in composure. Elvis, dressed sharply but without extravagance, leaned toward the microphone. His voice was calm, measured. "I did my duty. I served my country. I lost the person dearest to me while I was away. If singing about love is immoral, then maybe we need to look at what we're calling morality. Because I'll tell you what, I've seen real immorality. I've seen it in broken families, in hatred, in violence. Music isn't the problem. It might be one of the few things keeping people together." The room went still. Some reporters scribbled furiously, others hesitated, caught off guard by the candor. The words were printed the next morning in bold, some praising his dignity, others calling it defiance. But the effect was undeniable. Once again, the boy they had tried to frame as reckless now spoke with the weight of a man who had carried a rifle, buried a mother, and returned to find himself judged yet again. Meanwhile, a new crop of performers was rising. Fresh-faced singers presented as wholesome alternatives to Presley. Politicians pointed to them approvingly, parading them as proof that America could produce stars without controversy. But teenagers weren't buying it. They lined up for Elvis. His records outsold the newcomers. His name filled marquees while others faded quickly into the background. Still, the strain was real. Privately, Elvis confessed to friends that the constant suspicion wore him down. He wanted to sing, to act, to live without every word being turned into a weapon. But he also understood that his very existence on stage had become more than entertainment. It was a battleground. The louder the critics shouted, the more determined he felt to prove them wrong. By the end of 1961, Elvis had reclaimed his throne as the undisputed king of American popular music. His concerts drew thousands, his films packed theaters, his records sold in the millions. Yet in Washington, pastors' pulpits, and the opinion pages of newspapers, the war of words continued. They could not forgive him for surviving the crucible they had designed to end him. And so, the struggle entered a new phase. No longer a question of whether he could endure, but whether he could keep his soul intact amid the relentless push and pull of fame, commerce, and condemnation. The boy who had once been branded dangerous had returned as a man who now embodied something even more unsettling to his critics: resilience. And resilience, they would soon learn, was far harder to silence than a swivel of the hips. By the mid-1960s, Elvis Presley was everywhere, and yet, in the strangest way, he was disappearing. His face smiled from movie posters across the country, his name topped marquees in every city. But the electricity of the live performer, the danger that once rattled parents and thrilled teenagers, had been buried beneath an avalanche of formula films. The movies came one after another: sunny beach romances, cowboy tales, paper-thin musicals. Each script looked suspiciously like the last, And each soundtrack seemed designed less to capture his soul than to fill jukeboxes with easy-selling tunes. At first, fans rushed to theaters simply to see him. But after a few years, even they began to notice the repetition. The boy who had once shocked the world with raw power now sang lightweight numbers in Technicolor backlots. Behind the scenes, the architect of this treadmill was Colonel Tom Parker. To him, movies meant guaranteed money, wide exposure, and steady merchandising. He assured studios that Presley's name alone was box office gold, and they happily churned out productions by the dozen. For Parker, it was business. For Elvis, it was suffocation. At premieres, the contrast was striking. Crowds still screamed his name, but critics smirked. One prominent columnist quipped, "Presley has gone from dangerous rebel to harmless puppet." At cocktail parties in Hollywood, politicians and producers joked loudly that the so-called menace to morality had become a caricature, a toothless figure bouncing from one interchangeable script to the next. "If this is rebellion," one congressman laughed, "America has nothing to worry about." The ridicule stung. Elvis sat through screenings of his own films, fidgeting in his seat, cringing at the hollow dialogue. Friends later recalled him muttering, "This ain't me. This isn't why I started." Yet the contracts kept coming, and Parker's iron grip left little room for refusal. His private frustrations grew. In late-night conversations with trusted friends at Graceland, he confessed the emptiness he felt. "I walk onto those sets, and it's like I'm dressed in chains. I want to sing, man. Really sing. To feel the crowd again, but they've turned me into a product." He paced the floor, his voice rising, before finally falling silent, staring into the dark as though trapped in it. Meanwhile, the cultural winds were shifting. The Beatles had exploded onto the scene, bringing with them a new wave of songwriting, experimentation, and edge. Bob Dylan was reshaping the idea of what music could say. Compared to that storm of innovation, Elvis's movie soundtracks felt like relics. The press delighted in the contrast, writing that Presley had been eclipsed, reduced to background noise in a world he once dominated. Yet amid the mockery, moments of truth still surfaced. On one film set in Arizona, a teenage extra lingered after a scene. Nervously, he approached Elvis and blurted, "My father still says you're dangerous. But to me, you're the only one who feels real." Elvis paused, struck by the boy's words. In a world where he felt increasingly unreal, the honesty pierced through. He clasped the boy's shoulder and said softly, "Don't let anybody tell you who you are." You decide that the encounter lingered with him. That night, back in his hotel room, he replayed it in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of the old fire, the reminder that his voice still mattered, if only he could find a way to use it again. But Parker pressed harder, demanding more films, more soundtracks, more safe paydays. The machine rolled on. Elvis endured the routines, scripts read, songs recorded, cameras rolling, smiles plastered. On screen he was charming, light-hearted, endlessly marketable. Off-screen he was restless, growing heavier with each passing year, his laughter dimmer, his nights longer. And yet, beneath the fatigue and the cynicism, something was building. He felt it each time he strummed a guitar backstage, away from the cameras. He felt it when he sat at a piano late at night, singing gospel hymns until his voice broke with emotion. He felt it in the words of that boy who had dared to call him real, in a world determined to make him fake. To the outside world, Elvis Presley in the mid-1960s looked like a man conquered by Hollywood, stripped of his edge, mocked even by the same political voices who once painted him as a threat. But inside, a tension was winding tighter and tighter, preparing to snap. The stage was waiting. The silence was becoming unbearable. And soon, that silence would be shattered in a way no one, not the colonel, not the politicians, not even Elvis himself, fully expected. The studio in Burbank was sweltering under the heat of television lights. December 1968. For weeks, NBC executives had envisioned a tame holiday program. Elvis Presley in a sweater, singing carols, maybe exchanging scripted jokes. Safe, harmless, the kind of television that made sponsors comfortable. Colonel Parker, as always, approved of safe. But Elvis was restless. After years of empty movies and shallow songs, he could feel himself fading, slipping into irrelevance while the world moved on without him. The Beatles ruled the charts. Protesters filled the streets. Music had teeth again, and here he was, drowning in kitsch. This special was supposed to cement him as a family-friendly relic. For Elvis, it felt like a death sentence. In rehearsals, he whispered to his bandmates, "If I don't do it now, I'll never get another shot." "This is make or break," his voice cracked with both fear and resolve. On the night of the taping, the atmosphere backstage pulsed with tension. Executives barked orders. Assistants shuffled scripts. Colonel Parker paced, puffing cigars, reminding everyone of the sponsor's demands. Elvis sat apart, clad not in a holiday sweater, but in black leather from head to toe. The outfit hugged him like armor. It was bold, defiant, and nothing like what the colonel had promised the network. When he stepped onto the stage, the audience gasped. The leather gleamed under the lights, sweat already forming on his brow. He clutched the microphone as if holding on to life itself. Then the first chords rang out. Raw, unpolished rock and roll. The effect was immediate. The studio audience erupted, their cheers echoing off the walls. This was not the safe Christmas special NBC had ordered. This was the resurrection of something they thought had died. Danger, passion, the pulse of rebellion. Elvis prowled the stage, his voice fierce, his movements sharp and unrestrained. Every note carried years of frustration, grief, and longing. Between numbers, he sat in a circle with his old bandmates, guitars in hand, bantering casually, laughing, and then launching into the songs that had made him famous. The intimacy electrified the room. He wasn't an icon on a pedestal. He was a man, vulnerable yet unstoppable, reconnecting with the very essence of why people had once fallen in love with him. Producers fumed behind the cameras, but they couldn't deny what was happening. Something bigger than television ratings was unfolding, a reclamation. The audience sensed it too. They screamed, they wept, they clapped in unison, leaning forward as if witnessing a miracle. One journalist in attendance later wrote, "For an hour, it was as though time had folded back on itself. We weren't just seeing Elvis Presley, we were seeing the return of a force." The broadcast aired weeks later, and the reaction was seismic. Households across America stopped in their tracks. Children who had only heard their parents talk about him saw for themselves. Men and women who had written him off as a Hollywood puppet found themselves stunned. The leather suit, the sweat, the unfiltered performances, it was all anyone could talk about. Newspapers screamed the headlines, "Elvis is back." Politicians, who had once mocked him as a faded joke, were silent. Some of the same preachers who had sneered at his films now found their congregations buzzing about the show. Young fans, too young to remember the scandal of the 1950s, felt the thrill of discovery. This wasn't nostalgia. It was a living, breathing fire. For Elvis, the special was more than a performance. It was vindication. Backstage, after the final applause, he sank into a chair, drenched in sweat, his chest heaving. A quiet smile crossed his face. For the first time in years, he felt whole. He had taken back his voice, his image, his purpose. Later, alone in his dressing room, he studied his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back was older, scarred by grief, weighed down by years of compromise. Yet behind the lines on his face burned the same spark that had terrified senators and thrilled teenagers a decade earlier. He whispered softly, as though confessing to himself, "I'm not done." Not yet. The '68 special didn't just mark a comeback. It redrew the map of his career. What had been written off as decline now became the opening act of a new chapter. The nation, and indeed the world, was reminded that Elvis Presley was not a ghost of the past. He was alive, burning brighter than anyone had dared believe. And, for the politicians and critics who had spent years declaring him finished, the message was unmistakable. The king was back, and he was more dangerous than ever. The America that greeted Elvis Presley in the early 1970s was not the country he had left behind in the 50s. The streets boiled with protests against the Vietnam War. College campuses shook with demands for justice and change. Parents feared their children were slipping into a world of drugs, defiance, and shattered traditions. The cultural divide was no longer whispered. It was shouted. And once again, Elvis found himself dragged into the center of a storm he had not asked for. His concerts, newly revived after the '68 special, became pilgrimages. Crowds packed auditoriums, tickets selling out in hours. In Las Vegas, the International Hotel was filled night after night with people desperate to see him. Middle-aged couples in evening gowns, teenagers in denim, even celebrities who slipped into back rows. He sang with a fury that surprised even himself, as if making up for the lost years of Hollywood. But politicians saw danger in his resurgence. One senator went on record, declaring that Presley's shows undermine patriotic discipline among our youth. The charge was strange. Elvis, who had worn the uniform of the U.S. Army, was now being painted as a corrosive influence on the very country he had served. Articles began to appear in national newspapers questioning whether his revival was healthy for America. "Is Presley leading the youth toward unity or unrest?" one headline asked. The attacks grew sharper. Commentators argued that his stage presence, still filled with raw energy, though tempered with maturity, was a distraction at a time when young people should be focused on duty, not indulgence. Pastors accused him of turning concert halls into temples of idolatry. The old script was back, only louder, sharpened by the tensions of a divided nation. Elvis, however, was no longer the boy cornered at a press conference. He was a man who had endured loss, service, ridicule, and rebirth. And he made a decision that startled everyone. He would meet the criticism head-on, not by defiance, but by stepping into the political arena itself. In December 1970, dressed in a purple velvet suit, Elvis walked through the gates of the White House. He had requested a meeting with President Richard Nixon, a request that startled aides but was granted quickly. The photographs from that day would become iconic. Presley, with his oversized collar and jeweled belt, shaking hands with Nixon in the Oval Office. The public never knew the full details of their conversation, but whispers spread. Elvis had come, not to beg for approval, but to offer himself as an ally. He told Nixon that young people listened to him in a way they would never listen to politicians. He wanted to use that influence to steer them away from drugs and despair. "I can reach them," he insisted. "I can help." The irony was striking. For decades, Lawmakers had called him a corrupter of youth. Now he stood in the highest office of the land, presenting himself as a potential safeguard for the very generation they claimed he endangered. The critics didn't know how to respond. Some mocked him, a pop star playing statesman. Others whispered uneasily that maybe he had outgrown the caricature they had built around him. Back on stage, the impact of that meeting seemed to fuel him. When he sang in Las Vegas or on tour, there was a new intensity in his voice, a conviction that reached beyond entertainment. He often spoke to audiences about faith, about unity, about the struggles of ordinary people. He never pretended to be a politician, but his presence, his words, carried a strange moral weight. The press, hungry for scandal, spun rumors. Is Elvis working with the government? Has the king turned into a political tool? In reality, it was simpler. He was trying, in his own flawed way, to bridge a chasm that seemed unbridgeable. He believed music could still be a kind of medicine, even in a fractured America. The clash with politics did not end with his handshake in the Oval Office. Senators continued to grumble. Preachers thundered. Critics sneered. But the narrative had shifted. The boy they had once dismissed as a threat now carried himself like a man determined to use his voice for something larger. And for the millions who packed arenas to see him, who watched him bow low at the end of each show, there was no doubt. Whatever the politicians said, Elvis Presley had become more than a singer. He was a symbol of survival in a country searching desperately for its soul. January 1973. The humid night air of Honolulu vibrated with anticipation. Outside the Honolulu International Center, thousands pressed against barricades, clutching tickets and programs. Inside, the arena buzzed like a living organism. Spotlights scanned the vast hall where every seat was filled. Around the world, satellites aligned. This was the first global concert broadcast live, set to reach over 1 billion viewers. Never before had one performer commanded such a stage. Backstage, Elvis sat quietly, draped in a white jumpsuit embroidered with gemstones that caught even the faintest light. It was a far cry from the black leather of '68, but it carried its own meaning. The suit shimmered like ceremonial armor, a reminder that this was no ordinary performance. It was a moment meant to define not just a career, but an era. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, hands clasped in silent prayer. The show began with a roar. When Elvis stepped into the glare, the crowd erupted so loudly it shook the floor. His voice soared through the opening numbers, strong and clear, carrying across oceans. He moved with purpose, each gesture deliberate, as though aware that every camera, every screen, every living room across continents was fixed on him. Song after song poured out, not merely as entertainment, but as testimony. He sang of love, of longing, of faith. He reached into gospel roots and rock foundations, weaving them into a performance that felt both intimate and monumental. The sweat trickled down his temples, caught in the rhinestones of his collar, but his focus never wavered. In the press section, a journalist leaned over to a colleague and muttered, "It's like watching history happen in real time." Indeed, for those present, it was less a concert than a coronation. And yet, even on this night of triumph, the shadows of criticism lingered. In the days leading up to the broadcast, a reporter had posed a question that echoed the charges of decades past. "Mr. Presley, what do you say to those who still claim you're dangerous for young people?" He had paused, considering carefully. His reply was quiet, almost conversational. "Dangerous? I think hate is dangerous. Division is dangerous. Music is love. And if love scares them, then I'll always be dangerous." The words had rippled outward, quoted in newspapers before a single note was sung. They lingered now in the arena like an invisible chorus, resonating in every cheer. For fans, it was more than a clever answer. It was a declaration, a final rebuttal to years of attacks. As the concert built toward its finale, Elvis reached the microphone with a solemn expression. He sang, "I Can't Help Falling in Love," his voice tender, almost fragile under the weight of the moment. Couples in the audience held hands, soldiers wiped tears, children sat wide-eyed. For a brief time, the divisions of politics, generations, and nations seemed to dissolve. When the final chord rang out, the arena thundered with applause. Elvis bowed deeply, cape sweeping around him, his body nearly folding in half under the force of gratitude. He held the position for a long moment, as though giving thanks not just to the crowd before him, but to everyone across the world who had chosen to listen. Backstage afterward, he collapsed into a chair, exhausted, chest heaving. A staff member asked softly, "How does it feel, knowing the whole world just saw you?" Elvis wiped his brow, his gaze distant. "Feels like maybe I finally said what I needed to say." The next morning, newspapers from Tokyo to London to New York splashed his image across their pages. Critics who had once dismissed him as vulgar now called him a cultural ambassador. Politicians who had mocked him as immoral were forced to acknowledge the magnitude of what he had achieved. He was no longer the scandalous boy from Memphis. They could not deny that he had become a figure of unity, an American face recognized across continents. But more important than headlines or politics was the quiet certainty that lingered in his fans. They remembered his words, "If love is dangerous, then I'll always be dangerous." For them, it was more than an answer to critics. It was a creed, a kind of benediction. That night in Hawaii marked not just a concert, but a culmination. He had been denounced, censored, drafted, mocked, commodified, and written off. Yet, he had endured. His journey from the frightened teenager in a Memphis mirror to a man who could speak to the entire globe was complete. The applause eventually faded. The lights dimmed, and history moved forward. But the answer he gave, gentle, defiant, unforgettable, remained. It was not merely a defense of himself, but a truth larger than him. That music could carry love across boundaries that politics and fear could never bridge. And so the boy who once terrified America's gatekeepers left behind something they could not silence. A voice that outlived the noise. An answer that would echo long after the stage grew quiet.